In a span of just 3 years, Linux desktop adoption has grown 70%. According to data compiled from StatCounter, it rose from 2.76% of the global desktop market to roughly 4.7%. In the United States specifically, Linux crossed the 5% threshold for the very first time. Now, if you are a Windows user, those percentages might not sound alarming, but they tell a story that goes far beyond raw numbers. This video is going to go through all of it. Let us start with the foundation, the raw market data. For most of the 2010s, Linux on the desktop was a punchline. The phrase "year of the Linux desktop" became an inside joke in the tech community, something people said every year. And yet the needle never seemed to move. Linux sat below 1% for a long time. It crossed 1% globally in 2011, when then it took another full decade to reach 2% in 2021. But then something changed. The jump from 2% to 3% took only 2.2 years. The jump from 3% to 4% took just 0.7 years. The acceleration is not subtle, it is structural, and it is continuing into 2025. According to StatCounter, which bases its data on over 5 billion monthly page views, Linux reached an all-time high of 4.44% globally in July 2024. By mid-2025, it was hovering between 4.1 and 4.7%, depending on the month and methodology. India leads major economies with a Linux adoption rate of 16.21% as of July 2024. The United States crossed 5% for the first time in June 2025, reaching 5.03%, according to StatCounter's own figures, which were reported by both Linux Insider and IT's EOSS. Now, let's turn to Microsoft. According to the same StatCounter data, Windows held 73.38% of the global desktop market in December 2024. By later months in 2025, that had dropped into the upper 60s, with one reading from late 2025 placing Windows at 66.67%. That is not a catastrophic collapse by any means. Windows still dominates, but a decline of nearly 7 percentage points in the span of 12 months is, by operating system standards, a significant erosion, and the trajectory matters more than any single data point. Meanwhile, Windows active devices reportedly fell from 1.4 billion in 2022 to just over 1 billion in 2025, according to data cited by multiple tech publications. The single biggest catalyst behind the current Linux surge is one that Microsoft created entirely for itself: the end of Windows 10. On October 14, 2025, Microsoft officially ended free security updates for Windows 10 Home and Pro. After that date, users who did not pay for Microsoft's extended security updates, priced at $30 per year for individuals, stopped receiving patches. For most users, that means they are now running an unprotected operating system. Here's the problem. Windows 11, Microsoft's replacement, has strict hardware requirements. Specifically, it requires a TPM 2.0 chip and a supported CPU generation. Hundreds of millions of PCs that run Windows 10 perfectly well simply cannot upgrade. They are not broken machines. They are not slow. But according to Microsoft's own compatibility rules, they are ineligible. Some estimates suggest that around 400 million PCs were in exactly this position, functional hardware that Windows 11 refused to support. That left users with 3 realistic options: pay for Microsoft's extended support program, buy new hardware capable of running Windows 11, or switch operating systems entirely. A significant portion chose the third option. Zorin OS, a Linux distribution specifically designed to look and feel like Windows, reported over 780,000 Windows users transitioning to Linux in the immediate wake of the Windows 10 end-of-life announcement, according to figures cited by the Linux desktop market share research at commandlinux.com. Zorin OS 18, one of the more popular migration-friendly distributions, saw roughly 100,000 downloads in just over 2 days around the time of the end-of-life cutoff. And the numbers in StatCounter's data reflect this. Linux market share climbed from 3.72% in January 2025 to 4.27% by April 2025, a meaningful rise in a market where fractions of a percent normally take years to shift. The Windows 11 adoption situation has its own complications worth noting. Despite Microsoft's aggressive push to migrate users, including full-screen prompts urging upgrades and dedicated migration tools, Windows 11's trajectory has been unsteady. It finally eclipsed Windows 10 in June 2025, but then began losing ground. By December 2025, Windows 11 had dropped back to around 50.73% of the Windows user base, while Windows 10 climbed back to 44.68%, according to StatCounter data reported by Windows Central. Remarkably, even Windows 7, a version Microsoft stopped supporting years ago, ticked up to nearly 3.9% by December 2025. What this tells us is that users are not uniformly moving where Microsoft wants them to go. Some are staying on unsupported software, some are looking elsewhere entirely. While individual users are weighing whether to upgrade their hardware or try Linux, there is a parallel story unfolding at the government level, and it is being driven by something deeper than cost savings alone. In April 2024, the German state of Schleswig-Holstein made headlines across the technology press when it announced the completion of its migration away from Microsoft Exchange and Outlook and began actively testing Linux on its fleet of government computers. The scale of this is worth understanding. Schleswig-Holstein is migrating approximately 30,000 government employees off Windows and Microsoft Office entirely, replacing those tools with Linux, LibreOffice, Nextcloud, and Mozilla Thunderbird. The state's digitalization minister described it as a move toward complete digital sovereignty. Schleswig-Holstein expects to save 15 million euros in 2026 alone by dropping Microsoft licensing fees, according to a report published in late December 2025. Then came Denmark. The Danish Ministry of Digital Affairs announced a full transition from Microsoft to open source platforms, with the migration rolling out between June and November 2025. Denmark's digital minister, Caroline Stage Olsen, explained the motivation plainly. She said, "We must never make ourselves so dependent on so few that we can no longer act freely. Too much public digital infrastructure is currently tied up with very few foreign suppliers." France's National Gendarmerie, the country's national police force, operates more than 103,000 computers running a custom Ubuntu-based Linux distribution called Genbuntu. The city of Lyon has been transitioning to Linux and open-source databases. Copenhagen and Aarhus, Denmark's two largest cities, have announced plans to phase out Microsoft systems entirely, citing both costs and concerns about vendor dependency. These moves are not happening in isolation. They share a common thread: the fear of being locked into a foreign technology vendor under conditions that are increasingly unfavorable. Microsoft raised Dynamics 365 prices by 10% in 2024. Azure costs have risen, and critically, a legal concern has emerged that is difficult for European governments to ignore. The EU's Cloud Act problem, where Microsoft's own legal counsel confirmed under oath in the French Senate in June 2025 that he could not guarantee that European data stored on Microsoft's European servers was safe from silent US government access, has sent shockwaves through European public sector IT. And German MEP Alexandra Geese warned that Europe risks being blackmailed by both American and Chinese tech giants. The EU's Interoperable Europe Act, which took effect in 2024, now legally requires public sector bodies in Europe to consider open-source alternatives before purchasing proprietary software. This is not a fringe movement, it is a policy, and it is accelerating. Now let us talk about gaming, because this is where Linux has made the most unexpected progress, and where the most measurable data exists. Valve's Steam platform conducts a monthly hardware and software survey of its user base. For most of the past decade, Linux hovered around 1% of Steam users. It was a curiosity, not a constituency. Then came the Steam Deck. Valve released its handheld gaming device in February 2022, and it runs on SteamOS, a Linux-based operating system. Every Steam Deck sold is, by definition, a Linux gaming device. Valve shipped approximately 3.7 million Steam Deck units through 2024, with estimates reaching 5.6 million units by mid-2025, according to research cited by CommandLinux.com. The Steam Deck captured 48% of handheld PC market shipments in 2024. The results show up clearly in Steam's survey data. In October 2024, Linux accounted for 2.00% of Steam users. By October 2025, that figure had reached 3.05%, a 52.5% year-over-year increase, according to Valve's own survey data. By November 2025, it hit a new record of 3.20%. The more remarkable part of this story is what it reveals about who is driving that growth. Data from Steam's English language survey segment shows Linux at 7.09% in November 2025, up from 4.82% a year prior. And the distribution of Linux installs is shifting. While SteamOS accounts for about 26.42% of Linux gaming installs, a growing share is coming from users who have installed Linux on their own desktop machines, not just Steam Deck owners. Arch Linux and Ubuntu-based distributions are increasing their share, indicating organic adoption by gamers making deliberate choices, not just people who bought a Steam Deck. The engine behind this is Valve's Proton compatibility layer. Proton allows Windows games to run on Linux without requiring game developers to release a separate Linux version. According to research aggregated from ProtonDB community testing and Valve's own Deck-verified program, approximately 90% of Windows games now run on Linux through Proton, with over 21,694 titles officially certified as verified or playable on SteamOS as of November 2025. The total playable library through Proton compatibility extends to over 106,000 titles. What this means practically is that the old argument against gaming on Linux, your games won't run, no longer holds the same weight it once did. The remaining friction points are real. Online multiplayer games that use aggressive anti-cheat software remain problematic, and some publishers still do not test for Linux compatibility. But for the vast majority of single-player and indie gaming, the barrier has effectively collapsed. Linux's desktop growth does not exist in a vacuum. It sits on top of an existing foundation of dominance in other computing sectors that adds credibility and momentum to the desktop story. The Stack Overflow Developer Survey 2025, one of the most comprehensive surveys of software professionals, found that 27.8% of developers use Ubuntu for personal use and 27.7% for professional use. Factoring in all Linux distributions, the majority of professional developers are already running Linux as a primary or secondary environment. Linux powers 78.3% of web-facing servers globally in 2025. It runs 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers, a figure that has held consistent for years. In cloud computing, 49.2% of all global cloud workloads run on Linux as of Q2 2025. Dually among Fortune 500 companies, 72.6% run mission-critical workloads on Linux. In machine learning and AI infrastructure, 87.8% of workloads are processed on Linux. This infrastructure dominance matters for the desktop story because it means that the developers, system administrators, and IT professionals who shape enterprise computing decisions are already deeply familiar with Linux. The desktop transition, when it happens in an organization, is not a leap into the unknown for the people managing it. It is an extension of their existing environment. The broader Linux operating system market, which includes servers, cloud, and embedded systems, is valued at approximately $21.97 billion in 2024 and is projected to reach $99.69 billion by 2032, growing at a compound annual rate of 20.9%, according to multiple market research sources. None of this means the road ahead for Linux is frictionless. It is not, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that. Software compatibility remains the most significant practical barrier for mainstream users. Professional applications, particularly in creative industries, finance, and enterprise environments, often have no Linux equivalent or require significant workflow changes. Microsoft 365 is available through a browser on Linux, but not as a native application. Adobe's full Creative Suite has no Linux version. User familiarity is another factor. For people who have used Windows their entire lives, the interface of even the most user-friendly Linux distributions requires an adjustment. The installation process, the driver management, and the absence of certain automated software update mechanisms. These are friction points that matter to ordinary users, not just to technical ones. And in gaming, as noted, multiplayer anti-cheat software remains a wall for competitive players. Games like Valorant and certain other online titles explicitly block Linux users from competitive play. These are real constraints, not rhetorical ones. The question is whether they are permanent constraints or ones that erode over time. The data of the last 3 years suggests the latter. The year of the Linux desktop might not arrive as a single dramatic moment. But if the data of the preceding few years is any indication, it may already be underway, 1 percentage point at a time.